In the vast arsenal of weapons that Britain deployed during the Second World War, few pieces of equipment attracted more criticism, more professional disdain, and more condescending dismissal from armchair theorists and military commentators than the Enfield No. 2 Mark I revolver. Here was a weapon that seemed, on paper, to embody everything that was wrong with British military conservatism and institutional resistance to modern technology. While Germany equipped her officers with sleek, sophisticated semi-automatic pistols, while America issued her soldiers the powerful Colt 45 automatic, while military theorists everywhere were celebrating the triumph of the self-loading pistol over the obsolete wheel gun, Britain's officers and tank crews went to war carrying a 6-shot revolver, firing a cartridge that critics described as barely adequate, in a design that owed more to the Victorian era than to the age of total mechanized warfare. The critics had statistics on their side, they had the logic of modernity on their side, and they had the compelling narrative of technological progress to support their arguments. What they did not have was the experience of combat, because in the filthy, chaotic, desperately physical reality of actual fighting, in the mud of North Africa and the hedgerows of Normandy and the jungles of Burma, the Enfield revolver demonstrated something that no amount of theoretical analysis had predicted, that the qualities which made it seem inferior on paper were precisely the qualities that made it superior in practice. This is the story of the most underestimated service pistol of the Second World War, of the weapon that critics love to condemn and soldiers learn to trust, and of the eternal truth that in warfare, as in life, the difference between theory and reality can be measured in human lives. To understand the controversy that surrounded the Enfield No. 2, one must first appreciate the context of its adoption and the expectations against which it was measured. The revolver had been the dominant military sidearm for most of the 19th century and into the early 20th, but from the 1890s onward it faced increasing competition from semi-automatic pistols, which offered higher magazine capacity, faster reloading, and what their proponents described as superior firepower. The Luger, designed by Georg Luger and adopted by the German military in 1908, became the iconic symbol of the modern semi-automatic pistol, its distinctive toggle lock action and elegant lines representing everything that seemed progressive and advanced about German military engineering. The Browning designs that equipped many Allied forces and the American Colt Model 1911 reinforced the argument that semi-automatic pistols had superseded revolvers as military sidearms. By the time of the Second World War, the revolver seemed to many observers to be a relic of a previous era, a weapon that a conservative military establishment was maintaining out of habit and institutional inertia rather than sound tactical reasoning. The Enfield No. 2. Mark I was itself an evolution of an earlier design, the Webley revolver that had served the British military since the 1870s. The Enfield design, adopted in 1927 and modified through subsequent marks, chambered a cartridge designated the 382-inch or .38 Smith & Wesson, a relatively modest round that delivered significantly less energy than the 9mm cartridge of the Luger or the .45 caliber round of the American Colt. The revolver held 6 rounds in its cylinder compared to the 8 rounds in the Luger's magazine, and reloading was a slower process requiring either individual cartridge loading or the use of speed loaders that were not always available in the field. The weapon's double-action trigger, in the Mark I star variant that became the most commonly issued version, had the hammer spur removed, making it double-action only, and preventing the more accurate single-action shooting that trained marksmen preferred. This modification had been made to reduce the risk of the hammer snagging on clothing when drawing the weapon from a holster in a hurry, a practical concession to operational reality that was nonetheless criticised as a reduction in potential accuracy. On paper, the case against the Enfield was compelling. The Luger 9mm cartridge delivered approximately 500 foot-pounds of muzzle energy, compared to approximately 260 foot-pounds for the British .382 round. The Luger could fire 8 shots before requiring a magazine change compared to the Enfield 6 before a cylinder reload. The Luger's semi-automatic action meant that the trigger pull for subsequent shots was lighter and shorter than the Enfield's long double-action pull. In terms of raw stopping power, magazine capacity and theoretical rate of fire, the Luger appeared to hold every advantage. Military theorists who evaluated these specifications on a balance sheet concluded that the Enfield was inferior in virtually every measurable category. What they were not measuring was the one thing that actually mattered in combat: which weapon worked reliably when a soldier needed it most. The mechanical principles that distinguished the revolver from the semi-automatic pistol in combat conditions were not mysterious or obscure, but they required practical understanding of how weapons actually behaved when subjected to the conditions of real military service. A semi-automatic pistol is a mechanically complex device that depends on a precise sequence of events for reliable operation. When a cartridge is fired, the expanding propellant gas drives the slide rearward, extracting the spent case and ejecting it while compressing the recoil spring. The recoil spring then drives the slide forward, stripping a fresh cartridge from the magazine and chambering it, while the firing pin is reset and the sear re-engages. Every step in this sequence must occur correctly for the next round to be ready to fire. If the slide does not travel far enough rearward, if the spent case is not properly extracted, if the fresh cartridge does not feed cleanly from the magazine, if the recoil spring is dirty or worn, or if any one of dozens of other components fails to perform exactly as designed, the result is a malfunction. In the clinical environment of a pistol range, with clean ammunition, a clean weapon, and unlimited time to clear stoppages, these malfunctions are minor inconveniences. In combat, they can be fatal. The conditions that produced malfunctions in semi-automatic pistols were precisely the conditions of military service in the field. Dirt and sand, the universal companions of the soldier, infiltrated the action and prevented the smooth movement of components against each other. In the western desert of North Africa, where fine, penetrating sand found its way into every mechanism regardless of cleaning intervals, semi-automatic pistols regularly failed to cycle reliably. Mud in the Italian campaign performed the same sabotage, packing into the action and preventing the slide from travelling its full distance. Extreme cold in Northern Europe and the Scandinavian theatre caused lubricating oils to thicken, increasing friction and slowing the cycling of semi-automatic actions to the point where reliability became unacceptable. Worn or damaged magazines, perhaps the single most common cause of semi-automatic pistol malfunctions, could cause feeding failures that left the weapon unable to chamber a fresh round at any moment. A single damaged feed lip on a magazine, the result of being dropped on a hard surface or compressed against another object in a pack or holster, could render a semi-automatic pistol's magazine useless, without the soldier necessarily being aware of the problem until the moment he needed his weapon. The revolver suffered from none of these vulnerabilities in the same critical way. Its operating principle was dramatically simpler. Pull the trigger, the cylinder rotates, the hammer falls, the cartridge fires. There was no cycling action that could be compromised by dirt or extreme temperature. There were no magazines with feed lips to be damaged. The fired case remained in the cylinder rather than being ejected, which meant there were no extraction or ejection failures of the kind that regularly disabled semi-automatic pistols in field conditions. The Enfield's lockwork was entirely enclosed within the frame, protected from the environment in a way that the exposed mechanisms of the Luger and similar pistols were not. A soldier could drag his Enfield through mud, drop it in sand, submerge it in water, and in most circumstances pick it up, shake it once, and fire. The same could not be said with confidence of the Luger. The Luger's particular vulnerability to environmental contamination was well known to German soldiers who carried it in the field, and it was a source of bitter humour and genuine frustration throughout the war. The Luger's toggle lock mechanism, while mechanically elegant and theoretically smooth in operation, had relatively tight tolerances that made it sensitive to the presence of grit or debris in the action. German soldiers in North Africa and on the Eastern Front discovered that their Lugers would jam with disturbing regularity when exposed to the dust and sand of the desert or the extreme cold of the Russian winter. There are documented German accounts of soldiers trading their Lugers for captured British or Soviet revolvers precisely because the simpler weapons were more reliable in field conditions. The Walther P38, which replaced the Luger as the standard German service pistol during the war, was more tolerant of adverse conditions than the Luger, but still more complex and potentially less reliable in extreme environments than a well-maintained revolver. The stress physiology of actual combat further complicated the theoretical comparison between the Enfield and its semi-automatic contemporaries. When a human being is subjected to extreme physical danger, the body undergoes dramatic physiological changes that profoundly affect fine motor control. Adrenaline floods the bloodstream, heart rate spikes dramatically, blood is redirected from the extremities to the large muscle groups of the trunk, and the fine motor skills needed for precise manipulation of small mechanical components degrade significantly. Soldiers under fire have reported losing the ability to perform actions that they had practiced hundreds of times in training. Their hands shook, their fingers seemed thick and unresponsive, and operations that seemed trivially simple on the range became genuinely difficult under the physiological assault of combat stress. In this physiological context, the differences between the Enfield and the Luger became operationally significant in ways that specification sheets could not capture. Reloading a semi-automatic pistol required the coordinated actions of pressing the magazine release, withdrawing the empty magazine, retrieving a loaded magazine, inserting it correctly into the grip, and either manually chambering a round if the slide had locked back, or allowing the slide to chamber the round automatically. Each of these actions required a degree of fine motor coordination that degraded under stress. Dropping a magazine, fumbling to insert it, failing to seat it fully, or failing to release the slide completely were all common errors when soldiers were frightened, cold, injured, or exhausted, and each error could leave the weapon unfired when it was most needed. The Enfield's reloading procedure was not faster than the Luger's under ideal conditions, but it was more tolerant of the degradation of fine motor skills under stress. Opening the hinge frame, swinging out the cylinder, or in the case of the top brake design allowing cases to eject, and loading fresh cartridges required gross motor movements rather than the fine manipulations demanded by semi-automatic reloading. Soldiers who had completely lost the dexterity to reload a semi-automatic pistol under stress could often still reload a revolver. More practically, the Enfield's 6 shots in the cylinder before reloading was necessary meant that the average close-range pistol engagement, typically resolved in 2 or 3 rounds, was unlikely to require reloading at all. The tactical context in which sidearms were actually employed during the Second World War is also relevant to understanding the Enfield's practical performance. Officers and non-commissioned officers who carried pistols as their primary weapon generally used them in close-range situations, clearing buildings, engaging enemies in trenches, defending themselves when their unit was overrun, or dispatching wounded enemy soldiers who posed a continued threat. These engagements were typically at distances of under 10 yards, sometimes under 5, and they required the ability to fire quickly and reliably, rather than the ability to place precise shots at distance. At these ranges, the difference in muzzle energy between the Enfield's .382 cartridge and the Luger's 9mm was less significant than the theoretical comparison suggested, because at close range with good shot placement, both cartridges were capable of incapacitating an opponent effectively. Tank crews, who were perhaps the largest single group of Enfield users in the British Army, carried the revolver as their personal weapon for the specific scenario of bailing out of a disabled or burning tank and fighting their way to safety or friendly lines. In this scenario, the revolver's reliability and simplicity were paramount. A tank crewman who survived the destruction of his vehicle might be injured, disoriented, and operating in an environment of extreme stress and confusion. He might be pulling himself out of a burning vehicle through a hatch while enemy soldiers were approaching. In this situation, a weapon that would fire absolutely reliably with no preparation whatsoever, that could be drawn from a holster and fired in a single continuous motion, was infinitely more valuable than a theoretically superior semi-automatic pistol that required the user to be aware of its condition, ensure the safety was off, verify that a round was chambered, and manage a magazine that might be partially depleted. The double-action trigger mechanism of the Enfield Mark I Star, the variant with the hammer spur removed, was criticised by traditionalists and target shooters who pointed out that the long, heavy trigger pull required to fire the weapon reduced accuracy compared to single-action firing. This criticism was valid in the context of deliberate aim fire at distance, but for the close-range, fast-draw scenarios that actually characterise military pistol use, the double-action mechanism offered a significant advantage. The weapon could be drawn from its holster and fired immediately, with a single pulling of the trigger, without the need to cock the hammer or manipulate any other component. There was no safety catch on the Enfield that needed to be disengaged before firing. There was no need to verify that the chamber was loaded before drawing and firing, as the cylinder's contents were immediately visible to a practiced user. The weapon was always ready to fire, always in a known state, always requiring exactly the same sequence of actions regardless of how long it had been carried or in what conditions. The comparison between the Enfield and the Luger was played out in specific documented engagements that illustrated the practical differences between the two weapons. One account from the North African campaign describes a British officer whose unit was surprised by German infantry at close range. In the ensuing close-quarters fight, the officer drew his Enfield and fired all 6 rounds in rapid succession, hitting multiple opponents and creating sufficient confusion to allow his unit to disengage. After the action, he found that several German soldiers who had been armed with Lugers had experienced malfunctions during the engagement, the fine desert sand having infiltrated their actions during the approach march. The Enfield had fired all 6 rounds without hesitation. Another account from the Italian campaign describes a British sergeant who was knocked down and partially buried by an artillery explosion, emerging from the debris with his uniform covered in mud and his Enfield still in its holster. When he encountered German soldiers seconds later, he drew the mud-caked revolver and fired without any preparatory action, the weapon functioning despite being filled with wet Italian clay. The sergeant later reported that he had not expected the weapon to fire and had been genuinely surprised when it did. This was the Enfield's defining quality in the field. It worked when soldiers had no reasonable expectation that anything could work. The Burma campaign provided perhaps the most extreme test of the Enfield's reliability in an environment that was devastating to precision mechanical instruments. The combination of intense heat, extreme humidity, torrential rain, thick mud, and biological contamination of every kind made the Burmese jungle one of the most hostile environments for firearms maintenance imaginable. Soldiers operating in these conditions could not maintain their weapons to the standards required to ensure reliable function in semi-automatic actions. The Enfield's simpler mechanism proved more tolerant of the inevitable degradation of the maintenance standards under these conditions, continuing to function when more sophisticated weapons had become unreliable or unusable. The ammunition supply situation also favoured the revolver in some operational contexts. The Enfield's .382 cartridge was a rim design, specifically made for revolver use, and it could be loaded into the cylinder individually without risk of incorrect orientation or feeding problems. Semi-automatic pistol cartridges, particularly when handled by soldiers operating under stress, in darkness, or with injured or cold hands, could be oriented incorrectly in the magazine, inserted upside down in the heat of the moment, or fail to feed properly if the cartridge case was slightly deformed by rough handling. The revolver tolerated a wider range of ammunition condition and quality than the semi-automatic, an important consideration in theatres where supply chains were stretched, and ammunition might have been stored in less than ideal conditions. The psychological dimension of carrying the Enfield in combat deserves attention that purely technical analyses typically ignore. For the soldier who carried it, the revolver offered a particular form of confidence that came from absolute mechanical simplicity. The soldier could see at a glance whether his revolver was loaded, as the cartridges or empty cases in the cylinder were visible without any manipulation of the weapon. He could see without any mechanical knowledge whether he had fired 2 rounds or 5, because the cylinder's contents were apparent. This immediate status awareness was genuinely valuable in the confusion of combat, where a soldier who could not remember how many rounds he had fired might make incorrect tactical decisions based on a misapprehension of his ammunition situation. The Luger, by contrast, offered no immediate visual indication of its magazine contents without removing the magazine and examining it. A soldier who had fired several rounds and was uncertain how many remained had no way to check without a deliberate action that required attention and time. The Luger's loaded chamber indicator, present on some variants, indicated only that at least 1 round remained in the weapon, providing no information about the magazine's state. In the stress of combat, uncertainty about ammunition status could lead to premature magazine changes that left partial magazines abandoned or to running the weapon empty at a critical moment. The ergonomics of the 2 weapons also contributed to their comparative performance in the hands of average soldiers rather than trained pistol marksmen. The Enfield's grip angle and overall handling characteristics were designed for instinctive pointing and close-range shooting, reflecting the British military's realistic assessment of how pistols were actually used in combat rather than on a target range. The Luger's grip angle, often praised by enthusiasts for its natural pointing characteristics, was in practice problematic for many soldiers whose hand size and grip technique did not match the assumptions built into the design. The difference in grip angle between the Luger and more conventionally proportioned pistols meant that soldiers who had trained extensively with other weapons sometimes found the Luger's natural point of aim incorrect until they had accumulated enough practice with the specific weapon to compensate for its distinctive geometry. The maintenance requirements of the 2 weapons reflected their mechanical complexity and directly affected combat readiness. The Enfield could be adequately maintained in field conditions with minimal tools and basic cleaning materials, and a soldier with modest mechanical aptitude could keep it functioning reliably with the time and resources available in operational conditions. The Luger required more careful and complete cleaning to maintain its tighter tolerances, and fully disassembling its toggle mechanism for thorough cleaning demanded a level of mechanical familiarity and appropriate tools that were not always available in forward areas. An Enfield that had received only cursory maintenance would typically continue to function reliably. A Luger that had been inadequately maintained might function well, or it might fail at any moment, and the soldier carrying it could not easily assess which scenario applied to his particular weapon. The production history of the Enfield during the war also reflects the practical virtues of its simpler design. The Revolver was significantly easier and cheaper to manufacture than the Luger or similar semi-automatic pistols, requiring less precision machining and fewer components to achieve adequate combat reliability. This manufacturing simplicity meant that British industry could produce Enfields in the quantities needed to equip expanding wartime forces without the production bottlenecks that would have accompanied the manufacture of more complex designs. The Enfield could be produced by facilities that lacked the precision tooling and highly skilled machinists required for semi-automatic pistol manufacture, democratizing production across a wider range of industrial facilities. In a total war where industrial capacity was a critical constraint, this manufacturing simplicity was a genuine strategic virtue. The post-war assessment of the Enfield No. 2 Mark I by military historians and weapons analysts has generally been more positive than the wartime criticism suggested was justified. Historians who have examined actual combat records, prisoner interrogations, and operational reports from the theatres where the Enfield served have consistently noted that the weapon's practical combat performance exceeded what its theoretical specification suggested. The pattern that emerged was clear. In garrison, on the range, and in the minds of staff officers comparing specification sheets, the semi-automatic pistol appeared superior. In the field, in actual combat, under the conditions that soldiers actually faced rather than those that military theorists imagined, the Enfield's simplicity and reliability told a different story. Veterans who carried the Enfield through the war's various campaigns expressed views that reflected this battlefield reality. Many acknowledged the weapon's theoretical limitations, readily admitting that it held fewer rounds and was technically inferior to modern semi-automatic designs. But when asked about their confidence in the weapon's reliability, the typical response was unambiguous. The Enfield would fire when you needed it to fire. This was not a small thing. In the handful of seconds that typically determined whether a close-range encounter ended in survival or death, the certainty that pulling the trigger would result in a fired cartridge was worth more than any combination of magazine capacity, muzzle energy, and theoretical rate of fire. The Enfield No. 2 Mark I remained in British service well beyond the Second World War, seeing action in Korea, in various colonial conflicts, and in other operations through the 1950s and beyond. This longevity, in an era when semi-automatic pistols were becoming universally dominant in military service, reflected both institutional conservatism and genuine appreciation for the weapon's proven reliability in service. The British Army eventually transitioned to the Browning high-power semi-automatic pistol, acknowledging that improved manufacturing quality and design had addressed many of the reliability concerns that had favoured revolvers in earlier conflicts. But the Enfield service record provided a compelling argument that in choosing between a theoretically superior weapon of uncertain reliability and a theoretically inferior weapon of certain reliability, the latter might be the wiser choice. The broader lesson of the Enfield versus Luger comparison extends far beyond military small arms to fundamental principles about the design of tools intended for use under stress. The most important quality of any implement used in life or death situations is not its theoretical peak performance, but its minimum guaranteed performance under the worst conditions its user is likely to face. A weapon that performs brilliantly in ideal conditions but fails under adverse conditions is less valuable than one that performs adequately under both conditions, because the user cannot choose when the adversity will arrive. The Enfield embodied this principle with the economy of a weapon designed before the age of theoretical optimization, when engineers designed for the soldier they knew rather than the soldier they imagined. The Luger's elegance, its precision, and its theoretical superiority represented one approach to the engineering of military weapons: optimize for peak performance, trust the soldier to maintain the equipment and manage the environment. The Enfield's simplicity, its robustness, and its practical reliability represented another approach: design for the worst case, build in tolerance for the inevitable degradation of conditions and maintenance, and give the soldier something that will work even when everything else is going wrong. History's verdict on which approach produced the better result in the specific context of the Second World War's combat conditions is not the one that the specification sheet suggested in advance. The Enfield No. 2 Mark I was not the best pistol of the Second World War by any theoretical measure. It was not the most powerful, not the most accurate at distance, not the most modern in its operating principle. What it was, consistently and reliably across every theatre and every condition in which it was used, was adequate to the task and absolutely dependable in performing that task. In the brutal arithmetic of close-range combat, adequate and dependable was worth more than brilliant and unreliable. The soldiers who carried the Enfield understood this instinctively, because they lived with the consequences of weapons that failed, and many of them survived because their weapon, old-fashioned and derided as it was, fired when they needed it to fire. That is the highest praise any weapon can earn, and it is the praise that the Enfield No. 2 Mark I earned honestly in blood and mud and the terrible clarity of combat.